What is the null reference exception in C# and how can I fix it? We're going to look at several code examples, and after that I'm going to tell you exactly how to fix the null reference exception, how to avoid it, and how to deal with it if it happens in your code. Before we get to the definition, let's take a look at the very small code example. I have a person class with two properties, name and age, and in my main method, I declare a person object and assign it to null, and then I try to access the age property of the person object. This line here is going to throw a null reference exception. Now let's run the code quickly, and you can see we have the system null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object. So let's discuss the exception quickly. Why does it happen and how can we fix it in C#? The null reference exception in C# happens when you attempt to access a member, such as method or property, on a reference type variable which is actually null. This means that the variable has not been instantiated with an object or has been explicitly set to null. With that said, after the introduction of the nullable value types, which happened in version 7 of C#, you can get null reference exception when you're dealing with nullable value types as well. So it's not only the reference types, it is also when you're dealing with nullable value types, you can still see the null reference exception. Now let's go back to the code example. I'm going to change it a little bit. Instead of explicitly setting our person object to null, I'm simply going to declare it. And inside the main method, again, I'm going to try to access the age property of the person object. So let's run the code quickly and see what happens. And again, we're getting the null reference exception. So why does this happen? We have not assigned our person object to null. So why did we get the same exception? By default, all the reference type variables in C# are set to null if they are not initialized. So when I declare my person object, it is actually set to null. And later on, when I try to access the property of the person object, I'm going to get the null reference exception. Now, if you're looking at this code, you might think that it's quite easy to handle the null reference exceptions. I mean, after all you have to do is wrap your code in a try-catch block, and then right here, you can handle the exception, right? So let's make this more complicated to demonstrate how this null reference exception can get quite difficult to detect and fix. Okay, so instead of my person class, I'm going to use two more classes, and let's create them first. I'm going to create a car class, and I'm going to have a public property of color, and I'm going to have another class which is going to be, let's make it car model class. It is going to have a public integer ID property, and my car is going to have another property which is going to be a car model, and we don't need the age here. Just to demonstrate the code, I'm going to have a public property car okay, so I created two more classes, car and car model. The car model class has a single property which is integer ID. The car class has a string color property and a model property which is a car model, and our person class, the original one, just removed the age because we're not going to need it, and I added the car property here. So let's modify the code a little bit in the main method and see how this exception can be a little bit more difficult to detect. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to initialize the person object, and then I'm going to make the name of the person Tony, and then we're going to create the car object, and then we're going to try to access the model ID number. So let's go model ID equals our person car model ID, and let's, we have a breakpoint here, so let's run the code and see what happens. Again, an exception, null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object. Now, if you don't see the code here, let's see, this is not a main method, this is another simple method that takes a person input. So if you don't see the code here, it's quite difficult to know which one of these objects actually calls the null reference exception. I mean, is our person now? Is the person car object now? Is the model now? So actually diagnosing and fixing the null reference exception in your real life applications can be quite difficult. I mean, even in this simple code, we have only 3 classes, we have a single method. It's quite difficult to find out which one of these objects calls the null reference exceptions. Why? Because right here we have a change references. The person car model ID expression is actually a chain of references, and we also have nested objects. So we can imagine if you have a much bigger code and you get this exception, you don't get actually immediate feedback. I mean, you don't know which one of these objects calls the exception. Okay, so now let's discuss how to avoid the null reference exception, which is actually the best way to fix these exceptions, and also how you can deal with it if it still happens in your code. As always, you can pause the screen now and read how to fix null reference exceptions in C#. These are the best practices, and I'm going to implement some of them in my code just to demonstrate how to use them. And then quickly, I'm going to show you how to deal with a null reference exception if it still happens in your code. Let's quickly discuss some of the ways that you can prevent the null reference exception. The first option was to always initialize your variables before using them. So in this code here, where we get the null reference exception, all I had to do is initialize the car model, and we can also make the ID 123, and now if I run the program, there's not going to be a null reference exception. We are actually going to see the car model ID printed to the screen 123. Now, this option is possibly okay if you have a very small application, like a test application like the one that you're seeing right now. In the real life application, this is not a good approach because it's not resource efficient. I mean, if you're going to initialize every single variable before using them, and then you only use them way later in your application, you're simply using way too many resources and your application is not optimized. And also in a more complex application, this relationship between the various objects could be dynamic, which means that you don't know at the time of any object creation which other object or properties you might actually need. So instantiating every single one of them doesn't make sense. So let's take a look at the other approaches. Our next option, if you want to avoid the null reference exception, is checking for null. So right here, where we're accessing the model ID, we're going to check all the objects for null, and we're going to handle the possibility in a different way. If person is not null and person car is not null and person car model is not null, then we're going to print the model ID to screen. The model ID is else. If one of these objects is null, we can just print another message. Okay, let me bring this up. We can print another message. If this is user-facing application, we just can print console write line. The car model ID is unknown, or if this is if you're doing some logging for yourself, then you can print one of these objects is null, whatever it helps you debug the application. But this is the other option. We're checking every single possibility for now, and we're handling each one of these possibilities in two different ways. And right here, I still need to add the model ID, and let's run the program. And we get the car model ID is unknown because the person car model is null. And if we change this back and actually initialize the model, we should get this line printed. Let's run it quickly. And you can see the model ID is 0 because we didn't set it. So the default integers in C# is actually 0. Another way to prevent the null reference exception is to use the safe navigation operator. So let's do that quickly. I'm going to make some changes to my code. And okay, so the safe navigation operator actually allows you to access members and elements only if the receiver is not null. Meaning if one of these objects, person, car, or model is null, our model ID is also going to be null, and we can handle this in two different ways. So let's do that. We can check if model ID has value. We're going to print the model ID and else, meaning if any of these three objects is null, we're going to print the same message, which was what the car model ID is unknown. So let's run the program quickly and see. Okay, we get the car model ID is unknown. Why? Because we didn't initialize the model. So if we do that here, we should get 0, or let's make it a bit better. The car model ID is 0 should be printed to the screen. Let's run it. The car model ID is 0. So this is another way to prevent the null reference exception by using the safe navigation operator. And when trying to avoid the null reference exception, you can also use the null coalescing operator to provide some default values. Now, again, we have initialized our person object, and we have initialized the car object, and we are not initializing the car model object, which means it is going to be null. And we can use the null coalescing operator to assign a default value to our model, and then we can handle the two possibilities and print the message that we want to print to the user. If model ID is -1, we can actually print the message. The car model is unknown, and otherwise we can print the car model. So let's do that here. The car model is model ID. So let's run the program quickly. We're going to get the car model is unknown, and if we initialize our model object, model equals new car model, and let's actually make the ID something else. ID is 25, and if we run the program now, we get the car model is 25. So this is another way to set default values where it makes sense in your code when you're trying to avoid the null reference exception. Okay, now let's quickly discuss one last possibility which you should not be using almost ever, but let's quickly do that So instead of trying to avoid the null reference exception, you might think that it's super easy to wrap all your code in a try catch block and then handle the exception any way you want. So let's do that and discuss it briefly. This is actually considered bad code practices, and for several reasons. The first reason is that the null reference exception is actually preventable, which means that you can use any of the other methods that we have discussed up to here to avoid the exception. And also, the exceptions are quite expensive. They add performance overhead, and the exception also can potentially hide the bugs in your application, which should be fixed rather than handled at runtime. So, is there any good reason you might want to use a try-catch block to handle the null reference exception? Well, there are maybe some extremely rare cases when you might want to do that. Again, this should be your last resort. But say, for example, if you're dealing with a legacy program which is massive and you don't know the code at all, and actually preventing this exception could take you days to step through the code and make all the changes and do the testing and stuff like that. So instead of that, if this exception happens extremely rarely, like once a month, it might actually make sense to use a try catch block and handle your exception, and this is going to save you a lot of time. Again, always try to avoid the exception, but if there is no other way, then you might want to use a try catch block to handle the possibility of null reference exception. And that was another tutorial from me which tried to explain how to handle and prevent the null reference exception in C#. Thank you for watching.